Hello and welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're really digging into a tricky issue in UK-US relations. It's these tariffs the United States still has on UK steel and aluminum. We're looking at a recent report from the Westferry Times that, well, it lays out just how complex this whole thing still is years later.
It really is. And it's not just abstract policy, It hits real businesses, real jobs in the UK. It's become a major trade headache for the government, especially when you see most European countries manage to get some relief.
Okay, let's break that down then. First things first, what exactly are these tariffs we're talking about?
So it's 25% on steel imports into the U.S. and 10% on aluminum. They first came in back in 2018. The U.S. used Section 232. That's part of their trade law. They cited national security concerns.
National security.
For steel from the UK.
Well, that was the justification given at the time. The key thing is, after Brexit, the UK found itself kind of singled out. While the EU, for the most part, later got exemptions worked out, the UK didn't. Right. So years on, the UK still knocking on the door, basically asking for these to go and wanting like a definite date from Washington.
Exactly. They want clarity, a timeline.
But why is it dragging on? If the EU got a deal, why is the UK still, left waiting?
It seems to be a mix of things based on the report. Partly it might just be bureaucratic inertia in Washington. Things move slowly. But geopolitics definitely plays a big role.
How so?
Well, the current U.S. administration has put a lot of focus on shoring up ties with the European Union and also with countries in the Indo-Pacific region. You could argue that's maybe left the UK in a bit of diplomatic limbo on this specific issue.
Especially with that big US-UK trade deal not really going anywhere.
Precisely. That lack of a bigger trade negotiation framework means this tariff issue has to be tackled more on its own, which should be slower.
So it's less about the actual steel and aluminum and more about where the UK sits in the US's sort of grand strategy right now.
I think that's a fair way to put it, yes.
Okay, interesting. So how's the UK government trying to break this deadlock now? What's the latest strategy?
They seem to be sharpening their tactics a bit. More public pressure on Washington. The language seems a bit stronger, really pushing for that clear timeline we mentioned. They're aiming to get this resolved or at least see progress by the next UK-US trade and investment dialogue. That's coming up this summer.
This summer? But isn't there a US election just around the corner? Is that timing realistic?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? An election year can sometimes, spur action if it's seen as a quick win.
No.
But it can also just freeze everything, especially if trade becomes a hot-button campaign issue.
So the window for diplomacy might be quite tight.
Very possibly, yes.
Yeah.
Puts pressure on getting something done soon.
And what about the impact on the ground? The UK industry itself, what are they saying?
Well, groups like the British Steel Association, manufacturers, they're pretty much fed up. You can understand why. These tariffs mean their products cost more for U.S. buyers, making them less competitive. It's not theoretical.
Right. It directly hits their bottom line.
Absolutely. The report mentions UK steel exports to the U.S. fell, what was it, nearly 40% between 2018 and 2021.
Wow, 40%.
Yeah. And that kind of drop forces companies to cut back production. Sadly, it can also mean job losses. It's a real economic hit.
You said the EU gets some relief. How did they manage that? What did their deal look like?
So the EU negotiated a partial exemption back in 2021. It's based on quotas. They can export a certain amount tariff-free, but they also agreed to monitor their exports to prevent big surges, which was the U.S. concern initially.
Okay, so could the UK just do the same, accept a quota system?
Technically, maybe.
Yeah.
But politically, it's complicated for the UK government, particularly post-Brexit. Right. Agreeing to a quota, as the report suggests, might look like a big compromise without getting that wider trade deal they were hoping for. That's a tough sell domestically.
Okay, so this single tariff issue is actually tangled up in the UK's whole challenge of defining its trade strategy after leaving the EU.
Absolutely. It's part of that bigger picture. Having these tariffs remain, especially from a close ally like the U.S. when others got relief, it complicates the narrative about global Britain and its clout in trade talks.
Which brings us to, what does the U.S. actually want here? Is it just about limiting steel imports?
It seems broader than that now, especially under the current administration. They're increasingly tying trade talks to other policy areas. The report hints the U.S. is looking for the U.K. to align on things like climate standards, maybe cooperating on green steel production, and even some security assurances.
So it's not just about trade in the old sense. It's like
Yes.
trade plus.
Exactly. Trade plus is a good way to think about it. Resolving trade disputes now often involves showing alignment on environmental goals, security, other strategic priorities. It's a much more integrated, complex game.
And meanwhile, back in the UK, the government's feeling pressure from within.
Oh, definitely. You've got MPs, especially from steel-producing areas, pushing hard on this. And the Labour opposition is framing it as, well, a failure of post-Brexit diplomacy. Makes it a potential issue come election time there, too.
So looking ahead then, crystal ball time, maybe, what are the odds the UK actually gets this exemption this year?
It's tough to say. The window, as we discussed, feels narrow because of the U.S. election cycle.
Yeah.
A deal is possible, I think, if the UK can offer something the U.S. values in those trade pluses areas, maybe. And if the Biden administration decides a deal looks like a diplomatic success story before November. But it needs fast work, focused diplomacy, really in the next few months.
It really does show how everything's connected, doesn't it? Trade, diplomacy, what happens to industry, domestic politics. It's all in the mix here. And it's a fascinating example, like you said, of this trade pluses era, tying market access to bigger goals like climate and security. It really makes you think about the challenges and maybe opportunities for the UK as it finds its place on the world stage now.
Absolutely. Success in global trade today seems to require aligning on more than just the economics. It's values, policy, the whole package.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope that's given you a clearer view of this ongoing challenge and maybe some of its wider ripples. Thank you for watching Westferry Times.